I'm so pleased to introduce Patricia Alexander, PhD, to do our topic on critical thinking for our first P.I.E, Pedagogical Idea Exchange workshop. Thank you, Tricia.
Thank you, Lynn. Hi, I want to say that in preparation for this talk, I had the privilege of watching David Morris's talk last semester or last year. I'm not sure when it was. I was on sabbatical. But I was very happy to hear his ideas on critical thinking, and I agree with them. But I would like to also present a little bit of a challenge here as a kind of another point of view on how we can assess and teach critical thinking. I think that really this is not antagonistic to David's, it's just a complement to it. And I would recommend that people see his video on YouTube first, and then maybe if you're interested in the topic and exploring it from another angle, then have a look at mine. Hold on one second, I need my little clicker. I forgot about that. Is there a place to plug in? Sorry.
Hi.
Okay.
Hey, hi.
Okay, hi. How you doing?
Okay,
Okay, so are we in business here? Let's see.
I can advance them for you.
I don't know why that's not. Oh, there we go. Okay, first of all, I thought it would be a good idea to start with getting everybody's idea of a definition of critical thinking. I have my own ideas about it, but it turns out to be extremely important to know what we're talking about, what is critical thinking, before we have any idea of how to teach it or measure it. So getting clarification on what it is going to be extremely helpful. So does anybody want to give us your concept of critical thinking?
Oh, am I the only one?
Well, there are a couple of us here. I'll give you my ideas afterwards, but I just wanted to see if I could learn something.
I think of it as kind of higher level thinking, so thinking that goes beyond just memorizing and spitting out information.
Okay.
So the things like being able to analyze and synthesize and create something new based on ideas that you've learned.
Okay. Did I get most of that?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Anybody else?
I sort of think of it as a way for people to be able to question and challenge whatever ideas put forward.
Okay, so it sounds like the Skeptic Society. Caltech has a society for thinkers, and they call themselves the skeptics. So that's really a good angle on it too, is to be able to not take things in and swallow them that you're taught, but to ask yourself whether that really fits with your life experience and whether it makes sense to you, and so on. Okay, so that's great. Anybody else? Is that?
Well, also that the students, I guess, going along with that idea of questioning and challenging, that they're thinking for themselves beyond what is presented.
All right, so that's really useful, and I thank you because I got some ideas there that I didn't have. So it's always nice to exchange in that way. Now, I promised to tell you what I've been thinking and the basis that I've been operating on, and here's basically what it is. I look at critical thinking for the time being as a set of skills that can be taught to students. And I've been looking into critical thinking for a few years now, and one of the things that I know is out there particularly Peter Facione is an expert, and his group talks about not only critical thinking skills, but also a disposition or a personality that's open-minded, that's inquisitive. And so they include ideas such as being judicious, truth-seeking, confident in reasoning, analytical, and systematic as personality traits that may be, honestly, a little harder to foster, since personality is fairly set by the time you get to adulthood. So that makes for a very interesting discussion, and we could certainly assess it. I think it is possible that we could alter people's open-mindedness, let's say, and I think many of us try to do that. But for today, I'd just like to talk about the skills that I consider to be involved in critical thinking, and I'll kind of tell you why. And then in the last part, I'm just going to tell you a couple of things that I do in my classes to try to foster critical thinking, and maybe we can share ideas as well. Because honestly, as I was preparing this talk, I started thinking, am I really doing enough of that? And I have been inspired to try to find more ways to do it. Now, one of the things that you said reminded me of this cartoon a little bit that I found so cute. Here's the professor sort of expounding, and the students are all like, what is he or she talking about? And here the professor is questioning, and the students are all excited, and they're expounding. I thought that was a little bit in line what you're talking about. Okay, so what I did to try to get the lay of the land on what skills are really involved in critical thinking, I looked at some of the experts and some of the tests that are out there. One of them, and I mentioned Peter Facione before, is the California Critical Thinking Skills Test. Now, we had this fellow as a guest speaker a few years ago on campus, and it was quite revealing what they've been doing in terms of critical thinking. Now, their manual has this list of 6 skills, but it also has a kind of another one. I was a little confused, I have to admit, as to which are their main ones. But let's stick with these: analysis, inference, evaluation, explanation, interpretation, and self-regulation. And then compare that list. Again, these people have been doing this for years, and so we can consider them experts. And then another one, Harcourt has come out with the Watson-Glaser Critical Thinking Appraisal. They also have a list of skills that they measure with this critical thinking assessment. Notice that there's a lot of overlap here, which is kind of nice. So they have inference, recognition of assumptions, deduction, interpretation, and evaluation of arguments. Then, I don't know if you know about this, but at Long Beach City College, we went to the effort of developing our own critical thinking test, which also meant that we had to define the skills that we wanted to measure. And here's what we came up with. Once again, these skills are very similar to the ones that you see with these 2 other professional quality tests. So what we keep seeing over and over again is analyzing arguments and the like. Okay, but we have inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, problem solving, and making interpretations. So what I did here was a little bit of synthesis of my own, and tried to see what common denominators these 3 tests have for our purposes today. And these seem to be what they have in common. And so we've got 3 out of 3 of the tests. That's what that means. We talked about evaluation and analysis of arguments. I tried to analyze that. I couldn't see any difference between evaluation of arguments and analysis of arguments, so I just kind of combined them. And then inference, 2 of the 3 tests had inference that they measured. Interpretation, all of them, all 3, and the same thing with deductive reasoning. So for the purposes of just talking today, I thought maybe that would be a good list to use. Then, again, what do these things mean? I mean, you can say evaluation, but does it mean the same thing to everyone? I'm not sure. So I have on this slide given more of an elaboration of what each of these areas says about it. This is the Facione test. This is the Watson-Glaser, their definition of evaluation of arguments. And this is the one that we were working from in the ASLO committee here at Long Beach City College. And what I've done is put in the green font the things that are the overlap, right? So when the same terms come up over and over again, so it seems that evaluation has to do with assessing the credibility of evidence or statements, looking at the inferences that are made. And again, here's more emphasis on evidence, looking at whether arguments are weak or strong. Again, inferences and credible evidence. So we're beginning to hone in on what is meant by evaluation and analysis of arguments. Okay, and again, since the Facione test had both evaluation and analysis, I just threw in what they had to say about it. So, as I said, I didn't see really any difference between evaluating arguments and analyzing arguments. I could be corrected, of course, if anybody knows any better. And then the same thing I did with inference. So here's the Facione test, here's the Watson-Glaser test, and here's our Long Beach City College. We were kind of brief in our description of inference, reason, judgments, etc. But notice that it came up in the other definitions, which is kind of nice. Okay, so that's inference, and then interpretation was one of the ones that seemed to be common to all three tests. So that means, and I think this is a really good definition of it, that the conclusion is purportedly warranted by the arguments that are made or the evidence that's given. And basically, same thing, conclusions logically follow from the premises, basically saying pretty much the same thing. And then deductive reasoning, we can see also that the definitions for the three tests in the manuals, the stuff that was used as a background to developing the test, is very, very similar. Deciding whether a conclusion necessarily follows from its premise is the briefest definition, but they all pretty much agree. Okay, so here is where I bring David Morris back in. As I said, I was very excited to get to view his talk, even though I couldn't be there. And he gave a well-reasoned argument that suggested that you can't really measure critical thinking with a multiple choice test because, and this is a pretty persuasive idea here, you have to be able to hear the students thinking if it's out loud or be able to read their thinking in a written form. And he made the point that not all no answers or yes answers are equal, that a student could give maybe the wrong answer but have a really good basis for it that would, in a sense, if you're going to quantify this, give that person more points than a person who didn't have a clue what they were talking about. Right? And I thought that was an excellent point. I do agree that it's desirable to assess critical thinking with those formats. I find that when I read something my students have written, I can get an insight into how they're thinking, and I can take corrective action. That's really helpful. Of course, there is a downside in that if we're trying to assess this, it's quite time-consuming. And since probably every instructor is going to want to be assessing critical thinking for the purposes of our institutional assessment, that could be problematic for some people. So I'm going to make the case that you can measure some of these critical thinking skills with multiple choice tests. Again, I am quite sympathetic that it's nice to be able to do it and see how students are thinking. But in cases where the thought process has to lead you to an inevitable conclusion, the students either get to that conclusion or they don't. And the fact that they made it to the right conclusion and got the right answer can tell us that they hit the thought process just about right. Right? So not everything is in the way of multiple choice has to be omitted. In fact, what I'm going to do is take these different points that all seem to feed into analyzing and evaluating arguments and show you a multiple choice question for each one of them. Okay? So, and where did I get this list? I sort of, again, was doing some of that synthesis. I looked for the different points that those three tests and their manuals use to try to describe this area, analyzing and evaluating arguments. Because to me, it seems that more than any other skill, this seems to be at the crux of what is meant by critical thinking in most of the things I've read. Okay, so we're going to look at distinguishing component parts of an argument, assessing the strength and relevance of arguments, evaluating the credibility of evidence or statements, recognizing assumptions and inferences, identifying informal fallacies, and identifying sound arguments. So we're going to be looking at a multiple choice style item for each one of these. Okay, so the first one was distinguishing the parts of an argument. And here's a sample question. Most of these questions, by the way, have come from one of those three instruments. So these are very typical. Consider these statements. No uncommunicative people make friends easily. Ruth is not communicative. Therefore, Ruth does not make friends easily. Which of the preceding statements is the conclusion of the argument? Again, so that would feed into distinguishing the parts of an argument. If you're going to be able to analyze an argument, you need to be able to tell the difference between a premise and a conclusion. Right? So, does anybody recognize the correct answer? I'll take that as a no. Okay, so let's, I'll show it to you. The conclusion is that Ruth does not make friends easily. Now, most colleges and universities require a critical thinking or logic class. Those classes typically teach these kinds of skills, just face on, and then you can transfer those to others. One of the things that would be the clue here is that the term therefore tells you the conclusion is now coming. And that's valuable for students to be able to know because otherwise they can't tell you whether the things that came before, the prior statements, led up inevitably to the conclusion. So that is the conclusion, and in fact that is a sound argument. So that's not what we're looking at here. We're looking at distinguishing the parts of the argument. Right? And again, most classes would not teach this head on. You would get that in a critical thinking class. Okay, so the second one on that list of analyzing arguments was assessing the strength and relevance of an argument. And again, hopefully these are kind of fun. They can feel really difficult, and our students respond to them in the same way, but so does faculty. But I've tested the faculty. So let's look at this one. Should all young adults in the U.S. go to college? We're supposed to assume that each statement below is true for the purpose of answering this. Yes, college provides an opportunity for them to learn school songs and cheers. Would this be considered a strong argument or a weak argument for going to college, having everybody go to college?
Weak.
Yeah, okay, so that looks like a weak argument. Okay, number two, no, a large percentage of young adults do not have enough ability or interest to derive any benefit from college training. Now, we don't want to know whether it's true or not, because we're supposed to assume it's true for the moment. Is it a strong or a weak argument? If it's true. Should all young adults in the U.S. go to college if a large percent of young adults do not have enough ability or interest to derive any benefit from college training?
It's strong.
It's a strong argument. Okay, so if it's true, that would be devastating for that contention, right? Okay, number three, no. Excessive studying permanently warps an individual's personality. Strong or weak?
That's weak.
Okay, thank you. That is weak. Okay, so now we're looking at, we did really well on this one, and so with the weak argument for number one, it would be a silly reason for going to college to learn songs and cheers. It's not even necessary to go to college for that. And then number two, that is a strong argument. If it was true, it would be really a weighty argument against all young adults going to college. Maybe they should do something else with that time, and the country should do something else with the resources. And then the last one is weak because although of great general importance when accepted as true, it is not directly related to the question because attendance at college does not necessarily require excessive studying, right, as we know. And so, and so this is a nice one too because it gets at both parts of number 2, whether it's strong and whether it's relevant. So that's kind of a beautiful question for addressing number 2 above. Does that make sense? Okay. Then evaluating the credibility of evidence or statements. This one actually comes from our Long Beach City College assessment tool. A news anchor reports that alien abductions happen, showing a clip from a 1950s science fiction film to back up his claim. Suppose you also recently read in a tabloid article several testimonials from people who claim to have been abducted by aliens. What can you conclude about the evidence provided to support the existence of alien abductions? Okay, so first choice, people who report the news on television have to tell the truth so their statements can be taken at face value. Since the news anchor person provided evidence, the report of aliens may be credible. Citing a science fiction film is not credible evidence for the reality of alien abduction. Neither is information from a tabloid article. D, testimonials in the tabloid article are credible, but clips from a science fiction film are not. And E, clips from a science fiction film are credible, but not testimonials from a tabloid article. The right answer?
C.
It is C. That's correct. Okay, we're doing really well. Good critical thinkers here. Okay, so that's, again, addressing whether you can identify credible evidence. It turns out, by the way, that another thing that the Long Beach City College instrument measures is ability to distinguish fact from opinion, which is another aspect of analyzing arguments. And that happens to be the thing that our students are best at, just in case you're interested in that. Kind of fun. They don't always get these ones that seem obvious to us correct, so we have a little work to do. Okay, then this one has to do with recognizing assumptions. And we're told in the following statements, determine whether you think that the given assumptions are taken for granted. So the statement we're thinking about here is we need to save time in getting there, so we'd better go by plane. And so the number one, this is the thing we're supposed to consider. Going by plane will take less time than going by some other means of transportation. Is that an assumption that's made? Okay, does seem to be. There is plane service available to us for at least part of the distance to the destination. Okay, so it seems like that assumption is behind there, otherwise we wouldn't be considering this option. And 3, travel by plane is more convenient than travel by train. Okay, so this is not made because convenience sort of broadens the scope. We were just talking about timeliness, and now we're talking about convenience, and that might be things like being screened as a passenger, having to stand in line to get your baggage checked, and things like that. So yeah, that one is not one of the assumptions that's made by that statement. And again, we've kind of covered that, but this is the explanation for why each of those is a right or wrong choice. And again, this is the thing about multiple choice items is that the criteria has to be that there is a right answer for them. Okay, number 5, identifying informal fallacies. So what we decided to do, and so I copied that procedure in this item, for our Long Beach City College instrument, we decided that we wouldn't expect students to already know the names of fallacies, like straw man fallacy or slippery slope fallacy, and know the definition. So what we did, again, is something like this. We described what the informal fallacy was, and then asked students to recognize it. So a false dilemma claims that only 2 alternatives exist when there are other alternatives. Which of the following represents a false dilemma? So first choice, now they just want to register handguns. Next it will be all guns, and then we'll want to take all our guns away. Will be set up for a police state. So that's our first choice. Our second choice, B, either we pass a constitutional amendment requiring a balanced budget, or we let deficits ruin us. A rather timely topic, I must say. Okay, so, and C is we should ban all guns. Those who oppose a ban on guns don't think very many crimes involve guns, but statistics prove otherwise. What's our choice? We're looking for a false dilemma. Yeah, So B is the false dilemma. And what we did on our instrument here for the college is our other answer choices are typically other types of informal fallacies. And so I use that pattern again. This is not one that's on any test. I just made it up for the purpose of our discussion today. So the first one was a slippery slope fallacy, and the third one is a straw man fallacy. And so the one we were looking for is the B choice. Okay, the sixth aspect of analyzing arguments that we're looking at today is identifying sound arguments. Once again, in a critical thinking class or a logic class, this is something that students would practice. They would get the rules for what makes something a sound argument. There are several types of arguments that they would learn. There's syllogisms, but there are many other types, either or types of propositions. And so from then on, hopefully, students would be able to recognize those in other classes. Okay, so consider these statements true. Stylish dressers are neither flashy nor dull. If someone is not flashy, then such a person is tasteful. Which of the following must be true if both of the above are true? Now, before I ask you an answer, which of course it seems mind-boggling at first, does anybody know the procedure for how you solve this kind of a question? This is something that's typically taught in a critical thinking class, and then students would just launch right into it. Okay, the typical thing to do is to make a Venn diagram. And what that is, it's a series of circles where the first time you read something, the stylish dressers are neither flashy nor dull, you would draw a circle. I usually just put an S for stylish dressers, and then I put another box for flashy, not box, but circle, and another circle for dull. So we have three circles. Actually, why am I doing that? I'm right here. Let's figure this out together. Okay. Forgot I had this. So we've got our stylish dressers that are not flashy, so there's no overlap here. And this is, again, something that is typical in a critical thinking class, or dull. So that's our first one. If someone is not flashy, then such a person is tasteful. Okay, so that could be, we know that tasteful has to exclude flashy. If someone is not flashy, then the person, but also it tells us that the whole world consists of flashy or tasteful, right? So, in a sense, okay. Which of the following must be true of both? So then we just go through them. If someone is a stylish dresser, that person is dull. We already know that can't be true. No tasteful dressers are dull. That's not true, right? Because all we have to do is look at our circles. Stylish dressers are neither tasteful nor dull. Okay, that's not true. They can certainly be tasteful. Every stylish dresser is tasteful. Stylish is tasteful and not dull. Bingo! You see, once you have the procedure, it's really easy to get it. But at first, if you look at that and you don't have any cognitive map for solving this, you're going to be quite puzzled. And again, that's the value of, and the reason why so many colleges and universities require that kind of class. And then you transfer the learning. Okay, so again, this is kind of the explanation. So this is another form of Venn diagram. That usually this is the one with the circles inside it is what's given. Okay, so just I don't know if anybody knows that, but I taught critical thinking at Cal State Long Beach before I was hired here, and that is how I know what it is that's taught in a critical thinking class. Is that just every chapter has a different type of process. Not in addition to the ones that we're talking about today, there are things like problem solving, hypothesis testing, and understanding probability, which are typical. Even decision making is considered a critical thinking skill. So that's where you get most of the practices. What I find in my current teaching is that the things that work really well for getting students to think are to have, well, I'll get to that next, to have debates and have things, just as David Morris said, where you can actually see them, listen to them thinking, or see their writing documents. When I taught critical thinking, I didn't have multiple choice tests. I had, well, I didn't even call them tests, I called them demonstrations of learning. And then they had to solve these problems on the spot and actually tell me how they were thinking about things. And then what I would do in class was to have the students go videotape arguments that they saw maybe on the news hour, things like that, really high quality news programs where they make a practice of getting people with different points of view. And then they would bring them into class having already studied them themselves and ask for students to recognize informal fallacies or, and to look at the argument with the skills that they've been learning in class. And then oftentimes students would write position papers, and so that I could really see their arguments. And many times I tried to encourage them to argue against something that they believed. Right? So many times on issues there are 2 points of view. If they argue against the other one, they can really open up their minds. And then, as I was saying, when I started thinking about what do I do in my psychology classes, one of the things I realized is that I do a lot of sort of pre-critical thinking types of activities with them. I wouldn't really call them analyzing arguments, but the very fact that you get students to write something and then you scrutinize their thinking process is helpful to get them started. In my intro psych class, I actually have this assignment that seems incredibly easy, but it ends up not being all that easy for them. I ask them, based on what we talked about last time, to please write a question and an answer that we can use to review. And then I pick them up the next day that we have class, and I pick out a few that I think are really central or just interesting. And then I ask them the question, and they give me the answer. But they get a point for the question and a point for the answer. Here are some of the interesting things they'll do. I think I use one as an example here, that they'll say, what is the difference between this and that? And then they'll flip the card over, and they've just defined them, but not using a common dimension. So I just walk into class the next day. I usually save those cards, and I say, look, when you say, what's the difference between something, you have to compare them on some common denominator and make a contrast between them. And then I read them the example so that they can get it. Another thing they do is they say, what is X? And then I flip the card over and they give me an example of it. That doesn't work for me. So, or they say, what is an example of this? I flip the card over, they give me a definition. So again, that's hardly really impressive critical thinking, but it's a start to begin to think about, do these things match up? And that's, again, intro psych. So my research method students are a bit further along than that. But as I mentioned up here, that debates are really good approaches for getting students to think. They have their own rules too, because even appeals to emotion are legitimate in a debate. At least in my class they are. And they're not out in the outside world as good as hard evidence or research evidence, but they work sometimes even better than research evidence. So just even bringing up the discussion of what are the different types of evidence is really helpful for students. Okay, so that's it. And I'm definitely open to anything, ideas you guys have for how you teach critical thinking in your classes, because after preparing this, I'm a little bit more eager to do that. And
Do you or anybody else have a key to next door?
nobody? All right, then maybe we're done.
Okay, let's all thank Tricia, and I wanted to point out that the book club is going to be reading The Death and Life of the Great American School System, and Tricia, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.